Hey everyone, I've gotten quite a few requests to make available a semi-impromptu conversation I was invited to give to the leadership of a company just a few short weeks ago. Um, and I thought I would redo a version of it, make it available in hope that others might find the content useful. Generally, basically, the conversation was around how to use perspective as an intentional tool, and then how to use that tool to empower you to work beyond what you perceive to be your talent. So I call this conversation or this talk beyond talent. Um, let's see, just a little bit on myself. I'm from a small town in South Carolina. Grew up, served in the military twice, and enlisted in the Navy and officer in the Marine Corps. Ever since I left the Marine Corps, I've been in private industry in high tech companies. I've spent almost more than 20 years in high tech startups. Um, Love the fast paced environment of that. Love the constant change and love the impact, the empowerment that technology and tools can do for us. And I've always been intrigued by that. And a lot of what I'm going to share in this conversation came from something I challenged myself with. Wow, I guess it's been more than 25 years ago. Um, I was an officer in the Marine Corps doing really, really well. But it just dawned on me through a series of events and meeting different people as I traveled around the world that there was just a lot that I just didn't know about a lot of things, right? So I went on this very, 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 very serious personal growth mission of consuming an enormous amount of information, basically built around nonfiction books. And and I forced myself to bounce from discipline to discipline to discipline to discipline so I wouldn't get tunnel vision or a tunnel perspective. And something magical, I think, happened in that process as I started to see repeatable patterns across industries and across disciplines. I evolved to grow and use these perspectives in my life, and it completely changed the trajectory of my life. So today, what I'm going to do, I have a podcast where I've been talking for a couple of years on just perspective and food for thought, things to think about, largely in the bucket I call performance psychology, mindset, that stuff, peak performance. Share ideas that have come my way that I've either found intriguing and have tried and applied and got tremendous results, um, or ideas that I get from people that have spent tremendous study on the same focus area. Long story short, this conversation is just a couple of really big ideas that I think have the broadest ability to have the broadest or the biggest impact on anybody's mission in life, on anybody's path or journey or goal. They're that foundational, if you will, that fundamental. And it's going to start with the value of getting outside perspective, which is a lot of what having coaches and having these different ideas and these different mythologies and these different modalities, what they often offer you is just a different perspective on things you already know. So we're going to jump right in as the story has been told, at least to me, many, many years ago, maybe a couple thousand years ago, in the beginnings of what would eventually evolve to be the Olympic Games. People used to jump over the bar forward, like hop over the bar, try to leap over the bar. And the story goes that one day a gymnast who was taking a break from doing his tumbling was watching these high jumpers attempt to jump the bar. And he just casually mentioned to the jumper, he said that, when I tumble and I do a back flip, I actually get higher off the ground than I do when I'm doing things forward. And supposedly that was the seed planted that evolved into high jumpers jumping the way we now see high jumpers jump. And the thing I'd like to point out about that story, or what I think that story illustrates, is a couple of things. One, it's a great example of the power of outside perspective. It's also a great example that outside perspective can be tremendously useful, even though it comes from somebody that's not an expert on what it is you're doing, right? The tumbler was not an expert on clearing the high bar, although his perspective gave the person that was an expert on clearing that bar a different way of looking at it, and that went on to create a different level of performance. So if we would talk about why, one of the reasons why perspective matters so much, this I always wonder how it works when you do it virtually, but if you were in real life and I were to draw this little cube on a piece of paper and you stare at it, so I'm going to ask you just to stare at this cube. If you keep staring at the cube, if you keep focusing on the cube, something very interesting is going to start to happen automatically and pretty much outside of your control. The cube will start to flip perspectives. The back will become the front, the side will become the front. And once it starts, the longer you look, it's never going to really stop. It's going to keep trying to change perspective. And what this is a good illustration of is how your mind is constantly trying to give you meaning of information you're taking in. It's trying to give you, it's constantly seeking for meaning. What does it mean? What does it mean? What does what I'm looking at mean? And the interesting thing about this example is that you can imagine that people looking at this cube, you might have two people look at this cube, and you can imagine them getting into an argument over which side of the cube was actually the front side. But the real objective reality is this isn't a cube. These are just crisscross lines on a flat plane. There's no space in what we're looking at. That itself is made up. That's why I like this as an idea of opening our minds up, of opening up a conversation around the power of perspective. This constantly drive for our mind to give meanings to what we look at is what allows us to look at this image and have some people see a face and some people see a vase, or some people see both. But now that you remember the cube example, you realize that it could be neither. It's just our mind desperately trying to make sense and give meaning to what we take in. We also, with the vase example, now understand how, depending upon how you look at things, could determine what you actually see. And this example shows you clearly how two people could be looking at the same thing but from different perspectives, and both of them have different answers, but both of them be right from their individual perspective. So this just goes on to show us that how something appears to us is largely dependent upon our perspective. So now that we did that whole lead in on the power of perspective and how slightly different changes in perspective can create different meaning or different understanding, now I'm going to give you some big ideas that hopefully I'm going to encourage you to look at these big ideas from a different perspective, at least from the perspective of how meaningful these big ideas can be in your life, and how you may or may not want to address how you think about these big ideas or incorporate or leverage these big ideas in your life. The first really big idea is the nature of change. So, physicists and scientists will tell you that everything in the entire universe is moving. Everything is moving and everything is changing. Though it might be changing very slowly, everything in the universe is changing. We all know from experience, if you're from a small town like I am, if you're from a small country place, you've probably passed fields where you see the rusted out cars in the field and the rusted out tractors in the field. And you realize that that tractor at one point in time was shiny and new. But over time, it turned into this rust bucket we now see in the middle of the field. But here's the really blatant, obvious example, right? We all also understand that it didn't go from being a shiny new tractor to a rusty one overnight, instantly. It was slowly evolving into that. In fact, one might argue that starting from the minute it was made, without some energy being applied to it to keep it in the state it was in, the natural state would be to eventually start to evolve or deconstruct itself with rust and turn to rock. And that's with everything. Everything is changing. Everything is slowly changing over time. We've often been told that people don't like change, that people are resistant to change. Well, here's a different perspective on that. I'm gonna argue that not only is that not true, we are almost the opposite of that. We spend most of our time seeking change. Every time we move, we are intentionally changing our position. Every time we eat, we're changing our state of hunger. Every time we walk across the room, we are changing our location for something. We are in the world of constant change. What most people mean when they say we are resistant to change is we're resistant to the unknown things that might come along with change. But to generalize it and put it all in one bucket that nobody likes change and we don't want to change, that's just not evident in any form of nature. That's just not in nature. You don't find that anywhere in the universe or in any form of life. The best example I can give you of how powerful change is as an ally is by this picture. You're probably wondering why I have this picture of these frogs on a date, because now we're going to quickly talk about frog sex. So a great example of the intimate relationship to change and life and the survival of life or the persistence of life can be illustrated in a quick story about frogs living in a pond. So we all understand that if you put frogs in a pond, everything is changing, right? Including the water, the pond, the contents of the pond, what's in the pond, the chemical makeup of the pond as rainwater and things flow and winds change. And if that pond is close to man or civilization, we all know that radical change is being moved around Earth in water, in the air, and all these different things, constant change. But one of the most defensive things, or one of the best things that frogs do to ensure their survival is have little baby frogs. When two frogs get together, it's a random mix-up of genes, right? That's a massive change. You take two entities, and they create 3 or 4 or 5 new ones. Each one of those is uniquely different and randomized in their genes. And here's why that's so important. Because math would say that inevitably, if those genes just kept duplicating themselves exactly as they are, carbon copies themselves, eventually the environment, because the environment is constantly changing, would become toxic to the frogs and kill them. But because you have all of this variation, as the pond becomes toxic to some of the frogs, it is not toxic to other frogs, because those other frogs have a slightly different variation in their genes, in their gene expression, in their immune system, etc. So change, constant change, is fundamental to all organisms surviving. So we might want to just rethink the nature of change. The second big idea related to change is how we change forward in time. And there are 2 big categories I want to talk about today. And they're closely related, but they are not the same. There's growth and there's change, or better stated, transformation. There's growth and there's transformation. So growth is the continual change through the continual and related change, the obvious related change forward through time. So you can see a seed grow into a stem grow into a tree. The tree grows branches. The branches grow smaller branches. On the end of all of those branches are leaves, but all of those are obviously continuous. You can almost look at them in one snapshot and realize that they're all seamlessly related, right? So growth is an extension of the same thing. And growth normally happens slowly. Sometimes you can't even perceive it. You can't really, it's very hard to notice with your eyes the subtle change of a plant growing. But if you planted a plant and you went on about your life and you just checked in on it every now and then, you could clearly see that it has grown. The other idea of change is transformation, and that's to change, not to change slowly, but to actually change into something completely different. The most iconic metaphor example is that of a butterfly. We look at a caterpillar, it completely transforms into another thing that we have a completely name and set of characteristics that we apply to it, right? A butterfly. And although they have the same origin, we view them as two completely separate types of things. So here's the relationship between growth and change. We all know that there are elements in our life that require us to grow to experience, acquiring a new skill set, right? Often moving up a corporate ladder or changing or taking on a personal challenge or a career challenge, it requires us to have personal growth. And that's challenging for a lot of people. And it's challenging for a lot of people because they look at it only from the growth element. We've just talked about how hard it is to see growth happen. Growth happens slowly, persistently over time. What they may be missing is the change element attached to that growth. By the change element attached to that growth, let's just use weight loss as a really quick example to keep this moving along quickly to illustrate the example. People may understand the health benefits of growing into a healthier lifestyle, which may incorporate, working out, changing your diet, moving more, all of that stuff, right? Losing weight, all of that stuff. But the reason why they struggle with that is because before they can have a good chance at the change, they must first transform. They must first approach the change not as who they have been, but as a different person. And that's not as metaphysical or as magical as it sounds. It's literally as simple as making a committed decision. I would argue that the decisions we make determine the actions we take, and the actions we take determine where we end up. So the decisions we take determine our direction. Our direction determines our destiny. I'll state it again. The minute we make a decision that's a fundamental change in decision, that's fundamentally changed, we fundamentally changed our direction, which means we fundamentally changed our destiny. One more time. When we make decisions, we change our destiny. It's not that complicated. It's that kind of simple when you break it down and think about it. But in the case of growth and change, most people focus on the growth element, but they leave out the transformation part, the changing into something else. And the something else doesn't have to be physically something else. It just has to be committed something else. The minute you really commit to something new, it fundamentally changes who you are in that moment and the potential you have and the direction you're taking and the destiny that it will take you towards. That's the big idea. Change, understand the difference between growth and transformation. Get your mind around the idea of change, embrace it as a fundamental law of the universe you want to get on your side, not just go with the flow. The other big idea is to understand the difference between motivation and inspiration. Motivation and inspiration. For ease of conversation, we're going to say that motivation originates externally, outside of us, and we're going to say that inspiration has its origin internally. It's something that happens inside of us. We often use metaphorically fire as a metaphor for inspiration. Your house being on fire will motivate you into action to put the fire out. But there be things that happen in your life that light a fire inside of you that motivate you to take action in some particular way. A very quick example and a short story of where the whole power of motivation and inspiration was seared into my whole life, the essence of what I am as a person happened to me many years ago this was back when I was in the Navy days, and we are stationed on the ship in San Diego, and we were in the process of a workup to go overseas, to go on the Westpac, change home ports from the U.S. to Ping An. Anyway, it was a lot of stuff we needed to do, basically overhaul the ship. It was incredibly long work days, nonstop work, where we would pull out of port on Sunday and not pull back in till late Friday night. And we did this rotation. And if we had duty, we would have to stay on the ship for the weekend. I mean, it was just nonstop work. And I was young. I was 18 years old. And I was exhausted. I did not like that. And then one day, I didn't like the routine we were in. But then one day, the officer in the morning muster said that there was openings in pilot rescue swimming school. Pilot rescue swimming school. Now, these are the people, if you've ever seen the movie, I think Kushner is one of the actors in it, where these are the people that when a plane crashes, like in Top Gun, when the jet crashes at sea, they send the rescue people out to get them out of the ocean. The people that jump out of the helicopter into the raging ocean, those are pilot rescue swimmers. Those are Aquamen, basically, right? Now, the backstory on me. I was not afraid of water at all, and I could swim, but I was by no means Aquaman. I could swim, and I was not afraid of water, but I was not a proficient swimmer. In fact, back then I was so lean, I had negative buoyancy. I could literally lay on the bottom of a swimming pool. Used to do all the time as a kid. People thought it was the weirdest thing because I didn't just naturally float to the top. I could literally lay down there on the bottom. So anyway, I raised my hand to volunteer, and the officer asked me, you can swim? You want to be a pilot rescue swimmer? I'm like, absolutely. I want to be a pilot rescue swimmer. Because he said that the school started Monday, the ship was going out at sea Monday. I, in my mind, did the quick math calculation and said, well, if I go to this school, obviously I'm not going to graduate. I'm not going to make it, but even if I didn't make it out, if I failed in the school, the ship would be out for the rest of the week. I would at least get a week off, a week on shore. Crazy plan, right? But hey, you're 18 years old and bold and brave. All that, you know, I raised my hand. He sent me to the school. So I show up to this class, and we all around this pool, and it's like me and maybe, 15, 20 other candidates in this class. And all we have to do in the beginning of this class is you have to swim X number of laps under a certain time doing a certain type of swim stroke. Like the first could be the crawl, where you swim through the water that way. And you had to do it under time. So everybody lined up and they said go, and they had the stopwatches, and you had a bunch of coaches around keeping everybody's time. So we jump in the water and everybody's swimming, and obviously I'm not the best swimmer. I'm probably one of the more poorer swimmers. So everybody shoots out way out ahead of me, right? And I'm swimming, and everybody's getting out of the pool, and I'm still lagging behind. And I'm barely making it back to the edge of the pool right before the time limit cutoff. Because if you don't make before the time limit, you fail that evolution. But I make it just right before the time limit. But everybody else got there in enough time to get out of the pool, stretch, talk, rest. Not me. I got there just before the time, just in time to get out, just when they told us what the next thing was to do. So the next stroke. So you jump back in, it might be like breaststroke or side stroke, whatever. You jump in and we're going, and I'm even more tired, right? So I'm falling even further behind. People are literally lap me while we're doing these numbers. And then they're getting out of the pool and I'm way behind. And I'm thinking to myself, I knew it. I knew I wasn't going to make it. So this was to be expected. But then the unexpected thing happens. Out of nowhere, the people that had finished and got out of the pool and saw me struggling trying to make it started cheering for me. They started cheering for me to make it. And I'm swimming along, and I'm thinking to myself, man, what are they doing? Can't they tell I'm not supposed to be here? But I could, and they just kept cheering for me. You make it, come on, come on, come on. Everybody just started cheering. So I kept going because they were cheering. And again, I barely made it to the side of the pool. And of course, it's time to do the next one. Now I'm super exhausted. They again had time to rest. We jump back in. I immediately fall behind, and I'm trying to make it. And everybody's yelling and screaming, come on. Once they get all the way through and get out, I'm way behind now. And they're out on the side of the pool. They're just cheering for me to make it, cheering for me to beat the clock. And then something magical happens, and I realize that, man, even though I came here to fail on purpose, I came here to literally quit on myself, but I could not quit on those people cheering for me. I just knew I couldn't do it. So I'm there struggling, and then I have another really crazy thought. I realize how many instructors and lifeguards they have around the pool. They had like five or six. And I think to myself, well, it's impossible for me to drown. I can't. It's just, there's no way I could drown in this pool with this many lifeguards right here watching everything we do. So I make a decision. I'm just going to have to drown today. I'm just going to have to go down. And they're going to have to come in and save me because there's no way I'm quitting on these people as they cheer for me to make it. And I'm swimming and I'm now drinking water and I'm now choking and panic setting in. And I try to move to the edge of the pool and the instructor's saying, get away from the side of the pool. And I'm yelling and they're screaming, you can make it. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. And it's just chaos in my mind and panic in my mind until finally the instructor calls me over to the side of the pool. And he says, Seaman Man, you can't swim. He said, but we've been watching you out there and, we don't do this often, but if you go away, take some swim lessons, learn to swim better, we will let you return. That's a rare thing we do, but we will let you return. Now get the hell out of my pool. I was so exhausted, I couldn't even pull myself up and out of the pool. They had to pull me up. Some of the people pulled me up and helped me get out of the pool so I could walk to the locker room. And as I walked to the locker room, these strangers, these other people in the class were like clapping. Like, holy crap, what is going on? That was a life-changing moment for me, that whole crazy, chaotic thing. But here's some unique things when I look back on that moment. Here's some things that jump out to me. Well, one, that's a great example of motivation. I was motivated to avoid something I didn't like, right? The two primary sources of motivation are to avoid pain or to seek pleasure. By me volunteering to go to this thing that I knew I wouldn't do well in, I was doing both of those things, right? I was avoiding the pain of the workup, and I thought the time off would be pleasurable. But in that pool, in that moment, with all that cheering, with all that expectation, I was inspired. I got inspired, and I got inspired to do nothing but to survive, to not quit on those people. And that was a really powerful thing. Nobody woke up that day. I didn't wake up that day thinking I was going to go to this pool and have my life changed by a bunch of strangers around the pool. Nobody there could tell you to this day, could remember my name. No, they might not even remember the incident that was life-changing for me in many ways. They may not even remember the incident. Definitely don't remember who I am. None of the instructors got up that morning today and said, okay, today we're gonna go change some lives. We're gonna, my point is we never really fully understand what's going on in the larger play of life. We only understand what we look at and what we're able to perceive and give meaning to, and the perspective we have as an individual, which could be completely different from everybody else's. Obviously, I have no idea why those people started cheering for me. They didn't know me from Adam. So my guess is something in my struggle hit a nerve about something they could relate to in their own life from their own perspective. It's the best I can come up with. But it was a life-changing moment. It completely changed. I realized that the power of motivation and inspiration was very powerful things, because the sight of me being motivated others to inspire me. It's just this big, powerful chain reaction that I've never been able to let go since I found it. Big idea, motivation, inspiration, the difference between the two, and how the interplay between the two can come to serve you. Think about it from time to time. One of the last big ideas is one of the biggest ideas, one of the most common things we all deal with. Fear. Fear. Regardless of who we are and what station of our life we're in, the background music to everybody's life at some point is some type of fear. Now, we use code words to describe fear. We say things like timing not right, uncertainty, waiting for more information. We use all this nice, soft language that we lay on top of just a basic fear. We are afraid of something. And the people that tell you they don't fear anything, they're afraid of you understanding that they do fear things. Everybody has a fear. So I could do a whole hour-long thing on the relationship between us and fear, but I'm not. I'm just going to give you a couple of things, a couple of perspectives on fear that I found to be really, really valuable. There was one of the most successful people that I had known up until that point in time in business, had this leadership seminar. A bunch of leaders from a lot of different places all across the country flew in, and they were in this like training week, like leadership weekend. You know how these seminars and things people go to get better at being leaders, and it was one of those. And this guy had invited one of the best people he knew to come in and just share anything he thought would be useful to us. And he shared this story about the time that as he was at the top of his game in business, and he's really got focused on human performance and that type of thing, he reached out to a professor at a leading university. I can't remember which university it was. And this was a professor that focused on human performance. And he invited this professor to come in and spend the weekend. He paid this professor a huge amount of money to come just hang out with his family for the weekend and just share interesting perspective and ideas he'd come to learn about in the area of human performance. Think about that. That's a lesson in itself, that the super successful person thought the value of perspective was that useful to his family. But anyway, this guy comes in and he says, he talked about a lot of different things. He talked about success people are having with hypnosis and different types of therapies and all these different things. But he said, one of the most interesting things he picked up on that he had at that point in time, he had not had a chance to formally put it into a research project, but he said it's so compelling and so interesting that he's going to do it. He says that, when he helps somebody overcome a fear, and we're talking about, it could be the fear of flying or the fear of dogs or fear of public speaking, whatever. And he used whatever technique he used on people, whether it be hypnosis or some type of other therapy. He said, one thing he would do is he would give it, after he cured them of the fear, he would circle back around like a couple of years later to see if it stuck, right? To see, did it last? Was it temporary, or did it really last? And he said the interesting thing that jumped out to him as he talked to these people who had overcome these minor fears in their lives, and I call them minor fears because these are fears that are easily avoidable if we want to avoid them, right? They persist in our lives as fears forever because we never are forced into a place where we have to overcome them. So they remain there forever. But he said the interesting thing about people that overcome their fears is the rest of their lives changes in dramatic ways, not even related to the fear. And he was like, you have this person who you help overcome the fear of dogs or flying, and when you circle back around and say, hey, um, are you still not afraid of flying? Are you still flying from time to time? And they would be like, yeah, we don't, no longer afraid of doing it. I may not fly that often, but no longer no fear. But let me tell you what else is going on in my life. All kind of stuff was going on in life, from people leaving bad relationships to people starting new ventures to people making right turns in their life and taking total different directions in their life that led to amazing things. And he said his belief was that when people overcome fears, something happens in them that results in extraordinary changes in their lives, not necessarily related to the fear that they overcame. It's just something about that person's identity fundamentally changes, and the change is so profound that it goes on to empowers them to make enormously powerful changes, positive, powerful changes in their lives. And that makes a lot of sense when you look at how a lot of high flying entrepreneurs and a lot of these different people, we call them adrenaline junkies, and we call these people that constantly do these challenges like jumping out of airplanes and rock climbing, do all these things. It might not be the adrenaline. They might subconsciously have picked up on the pattern that overcoming fears creates some type of power in them. So I thought that was super interesting, and I thought that was really worth sharing, because many of the things we call valuable, many of the things that we set out there and we call them our life goals, or these dream lives and all this thing, they usually sit on the other side of fear or discomfort of some sort, right? It usually sits on the other side of that, and most people never really get there because they refuse to deal with the fear. They refuse to leave the comfort zone. All these things we hear all the time. You gotta get out of your comfort zone. You gotta be uncomfortable. You gotta become comfortable with being uncomfortable. These are just different ways of saying there's value in overcoming our minor fears, right? The other idea I had came to me as a mixture of a lot of things one day when I was talking about fear, and I was talking about one of my iconic characters that I reference a lot. Some people think that I am is Batman, right? And I talked about how that's a great metaphor of how a person started with a tragedy. If you know the Batman story, tragedy in his life with his family, created an environment that led to him embracing what he feared most, that became his primary leading character. He was afraid of bats because he fell into a cave. Bats scared the heck out of him. And then through a series of events, he determines to embrace the fear, to become his fear, and he becomes a champion of the people in the Dark Knight. I think that's a very good metaphor of this relationship between the potential power in us embracing fear, embracing challenge, embracing what we are afraid of, as a way to change fundamentally who we are into somebody probably more capable of becoming who we want to become. Hoping this stuff makes sense. The other idea, which was a really interesting idea that came to me, I was speaking on an audio broadcast once, and it dawned on me that bats navigate by radar, right? They send out sound. They're pretty much blind, but they navigate by radar, right? There's this idea. This is a mashup of two ideas. I hope it's not too conceptual for you. There's a matchup of two ideas. One, you know what a radar works, and you know how works. I'm hoping, and you know that I just told you that bat have radars, and that's how they can actually catch insects and stuff moving as crazy as they do. They can use radar to do that math in their head and intercept them in mid-flight. Okay, radar is one idea. The other thing is this idea made popular is the idea that when we remember, our brain is constantly trying to make sense of things. It turns out that our brain is really, really, really good at detecting patterns and understanding and recognizing patterns long before we are conscious that we are aware of the patterns that we've picked up on. It's a really interesting concept. I think it was made famous in a book called Blink, I think it was, and I think the author was Malcolm Gladwell, something like that. But anyway, he has this concept called thin slicing, which means with very little data, given very little data, we quickly understand and know things long before we know that we know them. An example I can remember he gave in that they gave somebody a chance to kind of randomly pick cards. I forgot the card game, but one card they stacked a deck against the person, so they cheated. But the person, as they was randomly doing things, picked up on the pattern long before he knew what the pattern was. That deck was something was wrong with that deck, and they have all these different. It's a great book to read, but they have all these tons of examples how with very little data, sometimes we can get a glimpse into where that pattern leads. But it happens before we recognize that we see the pattern. So we're not necessarily conscious of it yet. We're aware of it, and our behavior actually starts to adjust to it long before we can consciously say, no, I clearly see why this is bad for me, so I'm not going to do that this way. So it's a really interesting idea. But when you mash those two ideas up, I came up with this idea that, when we get these butterflies in our stomach, we get these things in our life, and we're going to speak in public or we're going to do something that matters to us. Sometimes we get this uneasy feeling, and a lot of times we call it butterflies, right? We call this queasiness feeling butterflies. My new way of looking at it, I call it bat wings, but here's what I mean by that. How do we know that what you're doing, like when you get an opportunity to speak to this person way up the ladder in your company, or you get an opportunity to talk to that person that you think could be your special person, or you get an opportunity to speak to this group of people, and you instantly feel those butterflies or that unqueasiness, that fluttering in your stomach, right? Most people just lump that into uneasiness or fear of something they should avoid. What if, though, you are thin slicing a moment, realizing that this thing you could do could lead you to something really great, but you're probably not going to do it because you're afraid of it? What if that's just a warning bell to pay attention to this thing and maybe push through? Huge. I have a podcast on it. I call it Fear in the Night, but it's the combination of that uneasiness we feel and uncertainty, and transforming the way we look at that from something that might lead to something bad to a warning bell that if we don't go through this, we might miss out on something good. Really interesting change of perspective on something very common we all experience when really relating to fear. The last big idea I want to talk about is the idea of focus. And when most people think of the word focus, what they think of is the elimination of things, right? You want to focus on things, which means you look at less and less and less things. But many people in the area of psychology and philosophy and performance will tell you what you focus on expands. They seem to be contradictory. And it's been said that Eskimos have 200 words for snow, to describe snow. 200 different words to describe snow, because their environment is so covered in snow for so long, and that's all they focused on. Remember how your brain constantly looks for difference in patterns and gives meaning to things, that they've been able to recognize and understand 200 different variations is in in snow, to the point where they have words for them, whereas we look at snow as being snow. They have a word for wet snow, cold snow, hard snow. I don't even know what they all could be. But that's a great example of what I mean by what you focus on expands. What that means is when you focus on things, you allow your brain enough time to get more information and to build more meaning around distinctions within what you are looking at, right? And the idea of focus, I'm going to talk about it from a more holistic point of view. When I was in college, I think it was either the college, what do you call the person, president or the assistant college president, was talking to a bunch of resident advisors. We had like a leadership weekend. A lot of stuff comes from leadership weekends and leadership events, right? And he said, when you look at people that have been able to persuade and be icons in terms of mobilizing enormous numbers of people through their leadership. An example he gave was Gandhi. He said that's because they are focused as an individual. And what he meant by that, he was clear. He described what he meant by that. He said that what they think and what they say and what they do are all in harmony. He said that's why they can speak for hours and hours and not repeat themselves. They have to repeat themselves. It's just a power that comes with being so in alignment with yourself. So having all the different parts of your motive, yourself, focused and in harmony. He said that most people are the opposite of that. They say one thing as they think another thing, as they do something completely different than either one of those things. He said that most people walk through life unfocused, and because of that, severely underpowered from the perspective of the potential of their personal power. So my takeaway is if we understand, if we just look at this whole little conversation and we understand now that perspective can result in physical changes in meaning and in performance. Remember the high jumper backwards? That's a difference in performance that came from perspective. And meaning often determines the level of our ability to engage motivation and or inspiration, right? What we think something means is going to be fundamental to the fuel required to ignite the fire of motivation or ignite the fire of inspiration, right? Being motivated and or I guess that's a word, inspired or inspired will allow us to choose to transform so that we can then change, as opposed to kind of unthoughtfully changing slowly over time. But we can choose to transform so that we can slowly change, transform into the person that has that destiny, so that we will do the things required for that, do the destiny, make destiny a verb. And all of that can be associated to how we perceive ourselves to be now, what we're choosing to do and not do. But now we understand that one of the biggest things that encourages us or drives us or enables us to do or not do something is fear. It's fear. And we all have this whole conversation in this idea that we live in a non-stop, ever-changing universe. We are the shiny tractor now. We will be the rusty tractor in the future. We are frogs in a pond, and the pond, as much as we might fight to remain who we are, the pond's not on our side. It's not fighting to remain. It's constantly changing. And inevitably, there's going to be a disconnect between the change in our individual selves and the change, how that matches up to the changing environment. Now more than ever, as we look at the impact that technology is having on the pace of change and AI and all these different things, it should be obvious to everybody now how wickedly fast things are changing around us. So we're going to have an opportunity now to let that be the origin of this fear originated story, or this fear inspired story that leads us down completely different meanings of what could be possible. And that leads us to different transformation, growth, all the stuff we just talked about. So realize that we are in a state of becoming. We are all in a state of becoming, but perspective is something we can use to calibrate what we are becoming. We can. It's the unknown variable. If you don't like who you are, if you don't like who you're becoming, the only thing you might be missing is just a change in perspective. And you can get that from a myriad of sources: outside people, other experts, listening to other people's stories, going to, reading books. All of those are potential places for perspective. And it doesn't take a lot, right? We're going to end this as we started it. It might just take as much as you happen to be in the mission of trying to do something so that you at least a semi-expert in a thing, but the only thing that's missing is that little bit of perspective. That stranger, that stranger cheering for you inside of the pool, that stranger whispering in your ear, hey, when I try to go over a raised bar, I do it backwards and I do a flip. My friends, I hope you got something out of this conversation. But these are some really big ideas, and these are the funnest ways I've come to share them individually. Hopefully you got a little of something in there that you can use, and you can use it to empower yourself to become super in a way that you want to be a little more super. Take care.